Thank you, Teresa, and thank you to the conveners for inviting me to speak. I'm just going to make this work, if I can. There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to preface what I say with a couple of remarks about what I'm not going to talk about, because that's actually important. Whenever you've only got a short period of time, like anything, you can not talk about a lot of other things. And it goes to the kind of question of who the we are, and also what does it mean to know. And I just want to note, really, being an Australian, that where the most recent research now suggests Aboriginal people have been living for 120,000 years, that in fact you have to be relatively creative in order to live in a place as difficult as Australia for 120,000 years. You also have to be able to think about how it is that creativity and sustainability and intergenerational knowledge transfer actually happens. And I'm not going to talk about those things, but I do just want to say that, you know, we're obviously talking about creative practices, we're talking about knowing in a whole range of different ways, we're talking about teaching in a range of different ways, writ large, although that's actually not what I'm going to talk about. I am going to talk about, you know, a kind of relatively small, bounded set of knowings related primarily to creative partnerships. And the reason I'm going to do that is because Creative Partnerships was the biggest funded program anywhere at any time on creativity, or as I would prefer to say, probably creative practices, because for me this is about doing and making stuff as opposed to a thing that's sort of there. And I think mostly when we talk about creativity, we talk about it as a thing, and I think thinking about something as a thing has a whole set of consequences which are different from thinking about a practice or a set of doings that people actually engage in. But Creative Partnerships was, where here it is an adjective, Creative Partnerships had very ambitious kinds of goals. It wanted to transform classrooms, it wanted to transform teachers, it wanted to transform schools and make them generally into wonderful places. It worked with, as you can see here, over 5,000 schools in the country, 90,000 teachers and over 1 million young people. So this was no small effort, and it's remarkable that a lot of people no longer think about Creative Partnerships and what it actually had to offer. And the places where it worked were, I mean, literally all around England, very different kinds of sectors, from, you know, kids in jails to very elite kind of schools, state-funded schools. And it also involved huge numbers of artists and arts organisations, because although it was a program which was designed about creativity, it actually primarily funded artists and arts organisations, and that's a kind of issue really that I want to think about a bit in my presentation. Obviously it had, lots of people had really high expectations of Creative Partnerships, what it could do, what it was able to do. You can see the same things now with the Creative Partnerships program in Wales and in Northern Ireland, where it's just being set up, Scotland, where it is also starting to emerge, parts of Europe like Norway, Lithuania, Germany, Korea, Thailand. It's, you know, there are versions of Creative Partnerships which have been I guess, established with the help of Creativity, Culture and Education, which is a charity which is really the kind of legacy of Creative Partnerships. It really wanted to do everything. It wanted to create young people who were able to take up work in kind of interesting ways. It wanted to help them learn better, that was sort of part of its problem. So a while ago, and again, apologies if anybody's seen me say some of this before or if you've read this document, we got a bit of money from the Arts and Humanities Research Council Cultural Value Program to look at the research which was commissioned by Creative Partnerships. And they had a very serious engagement with research. I mean, unlike a lot of reform programs, they commissioned research, they commissioned 12 really serious kind of reviews of literature. There were in all 74 pieces of research that they commissioned in their lifetime, and there's quite, and people in this room did some of that work, and so what we wanted to do was to have a look at that as well as a sample of the kind of school evaluations to see what people were claiming was the value of creative partnerships. And all of those evaluations are actually still intact. They're held in a kind of crumbling form on our website at the University of Nottingham. To my knowledge, they are the only intact kind of digital record of a school reform program in the world in this way. We do need some money to try and sort of stabilise it, and I imagine in 20 years' time this is going to be a kind of archive I hope that somebody will really want to work on and take seriously. What we saw, I think, within the research is that there was a lot of reference, as we read, in a kind of narrative across the research, and it was very difficult to do this kind of meta-analysis because there were multiple types of research at multiple scales, asking multiple kind of questions, and so the best we could do was a kind of narrative, and there was a lot of conversation about the type of young people that were being produced through these kind of creative practices. So it was a lot about the development of the whole person as opposed to, how well, of course there was reference, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but to, how well they were doing in their maths. But a lot of it was about this kind of more holistic development that occurred. There was because of the emphasis of the program, there was a lot about student leadership, about student voice, about students becoming involved in decision making. There was a lot of stuff about what it meant for young people to be able to use a wide range of media and platforms and genres, to be able to explore ideas, to practice things that they learnt, to present their learning in a whole range of different ways for assessment. There was a lot of conversation about in the research about changes to schools themselves and the way they thought about themselves, the way they represented themselves, the kind of school culture or ethos that they had. And there was a lot, I guess, which, somebody like Gert Biester would say is a kind of discourse of self-expression that came through the research. At a kind of tougher level, I think when we actually look to see, where could we say there was evidence that might be taken more seriously by policymakers. NFER did 3 or 4 studies of attendance using national attendance data. And in primary school, there were very significant gains in primary schools that had CP funding in attendance. Of some percentage at, scale in terms of increase. So that was kind of interesting. There is quite robust research, mixed methods research by colleagues in Cambridge about wellbeing. And positive impacts on wellbeing. There is some research around whole school reform, primarily case study, which talks about the kind of ecologies of school change and how leaders work, how middle leaders work, how that supports the work of teachers working with artists and arts organisations or other creative practitioners occasionally. And that research tallies very much with the kind of work that's been done in Australia by Anne Harris Morris and also Michael Anderson and his colleagues about what has to happen at a whole school level in order to actually create sustainable change in classrooms. There's a huge amount of case study work which focuses on different aspects of what we might call social learning. There's a lot about working collaboratively, a lot about decision making with other students. There's a lot about improved relationships with parents and communities, so again kind of case study work, and there's also some work around the development of the kinds of pedagogies that artists used, and the kind of also the sort of economic benefits to the artistic community. ICP poured huge sums of money into actually supporting artists, raising their wages, etc. But they also developed a very specific set of practices in working with schools and working collaboratively with teachers. What there was very weak evidence of were any changes in test and exam results. Interestingly, I think there's more evidence of that now, say, for example, in the CP work in Hungary, for example, where there's quite rigorous kind of statistical work around national exams, for example. But this was very disappointing to CP, of course, because this was their major claim to fame, was that they were going to actually change test and exam results. What we can say, I think, is that the way in which they set out to, and I won't go into this in detail, but just to say that the way that the research was constructed to test this could easily be challenged. So the fact that they haven't got it doesn't mean it wasn't there. It just means perhaps it wasn't researched in a way that was going to be productive. And secondly, there is certainly evidence in the evaluations from individual schools, particularly schools that had had involvement in the program for some time, of very significant changes in test and exam results. But those results were not connected to the kinds of national look that was actually being designed. So there's some issues there, I think, around the kind of evidence that was able to be produced from the body of research. I just quickly want to just look at the notion of citizenship just as an example of what some of the research actually has to say, and you'll see in a minute why I'm saying that. There's a lot of evidence about students engaging in in public activities that you might associate with citizenship, having ideas and communicating them to broader audiences through film, through visual art exhibitions, through writing, creative writing or journalism, through performance of various kinds. And there's quite a lot of evidence that students came in contact with a whole range of people that they wouldn't normally see. So their own kind of local horizons were widened quite considerably, in a lot of cases internationally, but also across class and race boundaries in kind of ways that perhaps are not available to a lot of students ordinarily. But there's a lot of evidence of that at the level of schools, and there's also a lot of evidence of quite strong links being set up with a range of community organisations and schools actually doing things that are of benefit to their community. So I think, for example, of one school that I was directly involved in researching, where they were involved in a housing regeneration project and worked with local people to help redesign the insides of these kind of new dwellings. So, there were things that kind of happened in CP that were really of value. But of course, their kind of espousing of what they call, and what was at the time popularly called student voice, was at the same time a bit sort of fraught. A lot of schools really took it on and really thought it was important. And students talked a lot about the benefits they got from these kinds of opportunities to take ownership, to have agency, to think of ideas, to work together to make decisions. But it was also the case that this was kind of limited, like it was limited largely to the school as opposed to taking on kind of broader political questions associated with citizenship. So we didn't see a lot of work like you might see at the moment about students being concerned about the environment, for example. That was sort of there and not there, I think, in a lot of the work. And you could say the same thing about racism, for example, about concerns about poverty. It was kind of there, but it was sort of polite in a way, and that's interesting as well. So there's a particular kind of what I would probably call sort of soft approaches to citizenship. And there were certainly cases, I think, where, somebody like Michael Fielding would be highly critical of the sort of appropriation of student voice. And I think the example always comes to my mind, which is there in the research literature, is of one school where they were involved with Paul Smith, and the involvement was to actually design a better school uniform. And I'm not sure whether that's actually what you might want to do if you were working with somebody like Paul Smith. So, there's sort of questions, and I think when you dig into any aspect of the research, you can see the kind of strengths and accomplishments, but there are also a set of questions that it raises about its kind of framing and what it actually was and wasn't able to do. And I'm just going to show you, this is by contrast, this is some arts research that I've been doing with my colleague Chris Hall, looking at arts education in 30 schools across the country, where I think because it's the arts, we've ended up with a much clearer understanding of the outcome of the program, of what we were looking for. So because we're looking at the arts as opposed to simply creative practices, we're able to say what is it that the arts actually do in terms of a young person's education. And we've got a kind of, set of theorisations that we can explain how it is, because of the schools that we've been in, how it is that the schools actually support young people to be what we call cultural citizens, not sometime in the future, but actually in their schools now. So the young people actually, and it is precisely one of the things that CP, I think, observed, this kind of capacity to engage in a public kind of conversation using a range of platforms, media and genre, but because it's the arts, actually, not bounded in terms of its topic. So a lot, you go and you will see, for example, Romeo and Juliet performed as, the Arab conflict. You will see, visual artwork about kind of addressing the environmental kind of challenges and extinction kind of questions, because it's the arts. So where asking critical questions is highly valued, and offering interpretations and possibilities for change are part of the kind of philosophy of all of the arts in different ways, using different modes of expression. So for me, that sort of question of what do we expect creative practices to do, what's the kind of goal that we think they're working towards, is a really important one. And it's one, I think, that we fail to address if we just talk about the creative industries. Creativity is not confined, if you like, creative practice is not confined to working in the creative industries. And I think getting a kind of articulation of which goes simply beyond doing better in tests and exams, which is what kind of CP saw was important, getting a kind of articulation of what we think is important would be helpful. I just want to finish by, and I know I'm on time now, sorry, that there were a lot of missed opportunities in CP work. There was an opportunity to do some really serious longitudinal work around young people who were engaged with creative practices in the curriculum and with creative practitioners over an extensive period of time. There were some young people who were engaged for 11 years with creative practitioners, and we just haven't got a clue about what that actually meant. So that was really missed. Some of the research was highly circuitous, so people looked, for example, at well-being, and they discovered that student leadership was really important. They looked at student leadership and discovered that well-being was part of that. It was a kind of circuitous nature and interrelated nature of some of the research, which I think goes to that kind of question of the ecologies that actually have to happen in order to produce change. There was a failure, I think, within CP to really seriously look at how you might actually look at what you've done beyond tests and examinations, or beyond a kind of rubric about creativity. So if you were thinking in interdisciplinary terms about how it is that bringing, the arts and another set of subjects together, how it is you might actually understand what was going on there and what was achieved, I think that was a missed opportunity. And I think there was still sort of inadequate examination of the arts nature of this. So some of the specificities of arts learning, I think, were obscured by the focus on creative practices, even though artists were, I think, 96% of the creative practitioners that were employed. So I think we lost some opportunity to understand more about the arts and arts education there. I think we've got a bit of an opportunity to have some conversation, perhaps, arising from the Durham Commission on Creativity, which is going to report soon, and I think which will probably have a bit of a crack at some of the dilemmas around, for example, the arts and creativity. I'm pretty sure they're going to have a go at, but also how it is that this kind of work can be sustained. Because I think what we know is that and we don't know in any kind of systematic way what has happened to the schools that were involved in creative partnerships. I think anecdotally, some of us have kept in contact with some of those schools. Anecdotally, we know people that have moved to other schools. Anecdotally, we know schools that have done a 180-degree turn. But we actually don't know the kind of longer term impacts of what that kind of engagement might mean. Perhaps the Durham Commission is going to give us an opportunity to look at that. So the questions that I was interested in thinking about, as you can hear, are to do with the kind of conflation of creativity and the arts, whether that's a problem and how and for whom, and really thinking about what are the most pressing areas that we need to research. If we are concerned about the arts, then the arts are in crisis. If we are concerned about creative practices across the curriculum, does the new Ofsted interest in creativity give us, in the curriculum, give us an opening, or does their embracing of a knowledge-rich curriculum need us to do something in particular kinds of ways in order to have conversations? And the final question, I think, is about how few of us there actually are working in this space. And our look, in fact, at the archive really showed, lots of very small teams doing quite small-scale research, and the kind of difficulty of aggregating up from case studies to actually create a kind of compelling picture really struck us, I think, as we were looking at the research. So I think there's a kind of question for us as a community of researchers about how we might bring our work together in ways that actually create something that's bigger than any of us individually. Thank you.